Coming up on the Razzball Fantasy Football Podcast, we discuss the league-winning must-have wide receivers for 2023. Are we going to be talking about some studs, some breakouts, some sleepers? Tune in right now for our top 5 must-have wide receivers, starting right now on the Razzball Fantasy YouTube channel. And bringing on just another, a must-have analyst in our industry. It's Ben Wasley. If you don't know Ben Wasley, you better go follow him on Twitter at FantasyFirstDownNo. Ben, what's going on, my friend?
What is happening? We are getting so close to the season. It is well into draft season. Everyone's talking drafts. I'm doing 4 at the moment. How many are you doing at the moment?
Only 2 right now in
only
the moment. In the moment. I know. What am I doing? Right. Well, I've already done like 3. They're already done. Yeah, so right. I'm in the middle of the slowest slow draft. It's actually, I've never been upset before about a slow draft, but we don't even get through a round a day. Like, it's that bad. And I'm getting to a point where, like, we're running out of days. We still have like 20 rounds to go. And at the rate we're going, I'm like, we kind of need to step this up a little bit. But anyway, but so how's your drafts going? Any common themes, any common must-have wide receivers popping into those lineups?
Look, I'm getting a lot of the guys we're talking about today. I reckon I've got today's guys in at least 2 or 3 of the redraft drafts I've done, and I've only done 4 of them so far. So or I'm at least into 4 of them. So it's real interesting. I've got one of those slow ones going as well. It's been going for 2 days, and I think we've done like 18 picks. It's partly my fault because I slept for 8 hours through one of them, but for the most part, it's going pretty well.
All right, that's good, man. Well, I mean, it is what it is, right? You sleep sometimes, and you're in Australia, so it's tough for you.
Yeah.
We'll give you a break. We'll give you a break on that. But on today's show, we're going to talk about our top 5 must-have wide receivers. And by the way, folks, this is interactive. This is live. Come jump into the comments. Let us know who your must-have wide receivers are. Ask us questions. Get engaged with us. Leave comments, whatever you want to do. Make sure you subscribe to the Razzball Fantasy YouTube channel and jump over to razzball.com. But let's get into our top 5 must-have wide receivers. Now, Ben, before we get into this, is there like a common theme and or something that you look for when you are trying to talk about must-have? Is it like you're trying to find more values? Like, what's the first thing you think about when you think must-have wide receiver?
The biggest thing that I've noticed when looking through these is the industry as a whole and drafters and things like that. They're always looking for the next hot thing. I tend to look at what's worked in the past. I tend to think, well, if a guy's been successful for the last 6 years, he's probably going to be successful again. We should just rely on that production. A lot of the time with a lot of the receivers, we see rising up charts, guys like, your Christian Watsons and things like that. We're taking a really small sample size and we're trying to project it out and say that someone's going to make a big jump. I'm saying, hey, 6 or 8 years of production means this is probably going to repeat.
And that leads us right into the first guy because, man, oh, man, DeAndre Hopkins, all the guy does is when he gets suspended, don't worry about it. I'm going to come back and be a wide receiver 1 for you. Don't stress. Now, the rank you see on the screen is my top 150 rank versus what we have currently on ADP at Razzball Consensus ADP. As you can tell, I'm lower than him, but you have him as a must-have wide receiver. So tell the people why you're taking him right now today at the 4-5 turn.
Yeah, look, the ADP has him as around the wide receiver 2021, depending on whether you're in half PPR or PPR. Like the industry as a whole is even lower than that. I've got him as my wide receiver 16 or 17, depending on the scoring format, because he's right next to Keenan Allen, who obviously jumps ahead in PPR. Look, he was amazing last year. He scored double-digit points in every single game he played last year. He played from week 7 to 16. Across those nine games, he had over 10 targets in 7 of his 9 games. He had at least 79 yards in 6 of his 9 games. He was the wide receiver 6 over that stretch, and he only scored 3 touchdowns. Everyone else in that period, in that area above him, scored at least 5 or 6. We saw A.J. Brown as a wide receiver 1 on the Titans. Realistically, they don't have a lot of other target options. Their defense is going to take a step back. They didn't draft a single defensive player. They drafted 7 offensive players. They strengthened up the O-line a little bit. I think realistically, we're going to see Derrick Henry doing what Derrick Henry does, but that's going to open up a lot of opportunities for DeAndre Hopkins. It's just Hopkins, nothing else. I really don't believe in Treylon Burks as anything more than a wide receiver 2. We both like Chigakonkwo. But realistically, Hopkins is going to be the number one option. He's going to be getting those double-digit targets that we see from the likes of Cooper Kupp in these weaker offenses where they really have to go to their number one guy.
So I think that's where we're going to kind of have to differ here. And the reason why I have him a little bit lower is that I do think Treylon Burks is going to take the next step. But also when I look at the situation from last year, some of your points are why I'm actually lower than him than ADP, because you talk about his target count last year. He demanded over 10 targets a game. If you look at A.J. Brown's best season in the Tennessee Titans, his 17-game pace was 129 targets. So if you just apply DeAndre Hopkins' career catch rate, yards per target, and touchdown percentage to those targets, he averages 13.3 PPR points per game. That's high-end wide receiver 3 numbers, and that's kind of where I have him right now. Now, we're kind of splitting hairs here, right? Because there is a chance where Treylon Burks, in some cases, he might miss a couple games because he did get hurt. Chigga Kongwu might not be an every down player, might not be able to block. We don't know yet. And DeAndre Hopkins is probably going to be, and he's got familiarity with Tim Kelly, so I understand that too. But at the same time, I just feel like when you factor it in, I just don't see him getting 10 targets a game in this offense, which is why I probably will have him closer to where I have him ranked versus getting him in ADP. So any final thoughts about DeAndre Hopkins before we move on to the next player?
I think the defense is the real thing that I think has changed from a couple of years ago when we had AJ Brown. I think they're going to be behind in a lot of games. I feel like they're going to be needing to chase points more than they did in a couple of seasons ago, where they were often leading and they could just use him as a bit of a luxury. I think they're going to need to force the ball to Hopkins because they're going to need to chase points in a lot of games. And realistically, Ryan Tannehill, I don't think is going to be able to do anything but just keep trying to check it down to Hopkins, give him a whole lot of targets and receptions to try to keep the offense flowing a little bit more.
Okay. All right. Well, you know what? We'll find out. Honestly, I love Hopkins too. I just feel like right now, I think with the Burks injury, he's going to even keep getting bumped up a little bit, and I think that's why I'll be out on him. All right, let's jump down to the next player. It's Amon-Ra St. Brown. This one is not this one's kind of just a flag play. It's like, for me, for fantasy football this year, I think the first 10 picks are kind of locked in, and people are going to disagree with me on Derrick Henry, but when you factor in how dominant he's been versus like the RB12 every single year, it's like he can regress by like 10 to 15% and still be a top 5 RB this year. That's how much better he was than everybody. But at 11 is Amon-Ra St. Brown. And he's kind of like my flag plant along with Tony Pollard. Those are the two guys where I've decided that if I'm drafted towards the end of the first round, they're my go-to second round picks, and they're the guys I'll probably take at the turn. And it really starts with Amon-Ra St. Brown. Last season, we kind of already saw the breakout. Like, I think a lot of people forget that he actually was banged up early. So he only played 14 games where he played 70% of the snaps or more. In those contests alone, he averaged 18.6 PPR points per game. That would have been wide receiver 7 last year, 2 points better in PPR than the wide receiver 12. So he would have been a difference maker. He would have been ahead of A.J. Brown, CeeDee Lamb, and he would have been right behind Devontae Adams and Stephon Diggs last year. The other thing I love about Amon-Ra St. Brown is Jared Goff is the most heavy slot thrower in the NFL. If you look at Football Outsiders metrics, they actually chart slot versus wide and how many times they target. 74% of his targets are to the slot or middle of the field. That is absurd. Now, I like Sam Laporta, but he's a rookie tight end. We know historically those guys typically take time. Jameson Williams, their number 2 wide receiver, is now suspended for 6 games. I just think that now he did get hurt, but it sounds like he's going to be okay. But over the next few weeks, if he's back in practice, ready to go, I think he's going to hit the ground running. And that's why I have him as a must-have player this season. So what's your thoughts on Amon-Ra St. Brown? Are you taking him at the 1-2 turn, or are you taking him a little bit later in the second round?
I'm a little bit later. I'm closer to consensus. I'm closer to where his ADP is. He's my wide receiver 9. He was my wide receiver 10, but especially in PPR, he bumps up a little bit. In PPR, I'm kind of okay with taking him like that, but I feel like there is the possibility that the Lions are able to drop back a little bit on how offensive they were with the ball. They really needed to be aggressive. They conceded the 4th most points last year, so they were forced to chase games, and they were effective in chasing games. But I think they only did it because they needed to. A lot of the time they were behind in games. They got into a lot of shootouts. I don't see that happening to the same extent here. In the end, they had the 10th most passing attempts and the 7th most passing yards. I don't think that's what they want. I think they simply needed to because they conceded so many points, but they were actually a good team. So with their defense picking up a little bit, I could see him stepping back ever so slightly. Having said that, he's really safe. He is a pretty safe option. Even if he's not like outdoing his ADP, you've at least got a guy who's probably a low-end wide receiver one. So I like the safety. It's also interesting that last year he was more effective in wins than he was in losses. So if we're talking about the team improving and their defense improving, the fact that he was still able to have success in wins is a really good sign. It's just a question of whether they'll be shootout wins or wins where they're kind of able to grind it out with the guys like Gibbs and the guys like Montgomery and try to keep the ball on the ground rather than airing it out quite as much. I can see the upside, but I just don't have him as high because I think the other guys above him just have a little bit more elite upside to really take him to the next level.
All right, let's jump down to number 3. It's Chris Godwin. Currently, my rank is 66. You have him at ADP's at 57. So you actually have him as a must-have player, though. So tell us why you're all in on Chris Godwin this season.
The reality is that this offense doesn't really have as many options as they've previously had. We know they've got Baker Mayfield. We know they've got Kyle Trask. They're not very good. Realistically, they've only got a couple of options, and those options are Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. But the profile of those sort of players, they're more likely to need to check it down and take those safer options just to get anything moving. I feel like that means Chris Godwin's going to get a lot of targets. We saw that last year. It was Godwin rather than Evans that they tended to rely on a lot more of the time. Last season, he was the wide receiver 15 in points per game, but he only had 3 touchdowns. In the previous 4 seasons, he had 29 touchdowns. We're expecting him to get some touchdown regression. And even without those touchdowns, he was already on the doorstep of wide receiver 1 production. Now, he will take a step back. I'm not saying he's going to be a wide receiver 1 next year like he would have been last year, but you can get him as the wide receiver 26 at the moment in ADP. So I'm expecting him to take somewhat of a step back, but not so much of a step back that he goes from like high wide receiver 2 to mid wide receiver 3. I think there's some area in the middle, which makes him pretty safe. There's a lot of target volume. Realistically, there's not a lot of target competition. I feel like he's the kind of guy you can just rely on as a fill-in like wide receiver 2 for your team, knowing that you can get him later in drafts than you need to.
So the first thing that worries me a little bit is that if you're looking at historical stats for the Tampa Bay Bucks, it's all skewed because they had the 2 most pass-heavy offenses when it was with now his name's Dirk Coiter, and then they went right to Bruce Arians. And so they had this ridiculous pass volume. Now they moved to Dave Canales, who's from Seattle. Based on my model, and I looked at Dave Canales' time with the Seattle Seahawks versus what the Tampa Bay Bucks had last season, it's calling for 161 less dropbacks. So that is a huge drop in pass volume. But then you just look at Baker Mayfield, probably the lead to win the job. We've already seen a 22-game stretch when he had Odell Beckham and Jarvis Landry as his 1-2 options in that offense. So if you look at that 22-game stretch, Landry averaged 13.3 PPR points per game, and Beckham averaged 13.1. You know, that in 2022, that's wide receiver 26 to 28, and in 2021, it's wide receiver 31, and 2020, it's 33 to 35. So, like, I actually think Godwin's fine. If you're telling me he's probably a high-end wide receiver 3, okay, I think that's realistic, and I think that's where he's going to finish. The ranking here, why I'm like a few spots lower, is because a couple guys we're going to talk about in a second. But it's also like, that's also if Baker clicks and he's going, and that's like if everything hits the ground running and the offensive line connects and, you know, all that stuff works. But it's like too much change, quarterback change, OC change, offensive line changes. And we saw with the Broncos last year, when you have that much change, it could be a disaster. So there could be a downside to Chris Godwin versus that safe. If his safety is like high-end wide receiver 3, I'm not excited to take him knowing that the downside could be worse. But I understand Chris Godwin's a stud, so that's why I'm not like fading him completely. But final thoughts about Chris Godwin before we move on.
Yeah, I just think it's the lack of target competition that means they're going to have to go with somebody. And I feel like they're more likely to give all those targets to Chris Godwin. Even in those offenses that really do tank and struggle, there's still usually one guy that's still functional. We saw that last year with Jerry Jeudy and the Broncos. They need to go to somebody, and it's generally going to be the slot guy that's going to be in the middle of the field. He's still pretty young. He's only 27. He's in his prime, essentially. He's not great at getting separation, which is my only concern. But I just feel like he's so safe that he's the kind of guy in PPR that I really want to take because you're seeing him fall in so many drafts.
You have me at safe. The fact that you're using the word safe, I feel safe right now. I feel very comfortable with you, and I feel safe with Chris Godwin as well. So I actually don't hate it. Plus, Russell Gage just got hurt. He's out for the season.
Yeah,
so that should help him more. So I get it. I'm in. I like it. I don't hate it anymore. Maybe the ADP needs to line up with the rank. I get it. I understand. But one of the reasons why he's not there, actually, that's not even true because the next spot in my rank is George Pickens. So, basically when I talked last time I talked about Deontay Johnson. So it's almost like tongue-in-cheek type stuff where talking out of both sides of your mouth a little bit in the sense of competition and all the issues. Deontay Johnson's a fade versus George Pickens being a must-have. And so the first thing I want to talk about is that Deontay Johnson is so dependent on volume versus George Pickens. George Pickens was able to do things last year with Kenny Pickett on very limited volume. All right. So that's where the key difference is. So the addition of Allen Robinson is going to impact a player like Deontay Johnson versus a player like George Pickens, who's more productive on his receptions and targets. But just a couple things. Matt Harmon, one of the better guys at evaluating receivers, talked a little bit about how he has kind of a rookie profile like Devontae Parker, Kenny Golladay, guys that don't create a lot of separation, but are very good at the point of the catch. And the good news for that spin is that Kenny Pickett, according to Next Gen Stats, was the 13th most aggressive passer, meaning throwing into tight coverage last year. So Kenny Pickett's willing to throw it up to George Pickens. That's great. But the other aspect I think that people don't remember is that he tore his ACL in the March of 2021. He did come his senior year, but it was at the end of the year. And we've kind of saw this with players like Cam Akers. They do come back, but it usually takes almost 2 full seasons to get back to your normal levels. So he did get hurt in March of 2021, which is essentially now it's well over 2 years ago. I do think there was a little bit of that early on in the season, especially for him to get up to speed. But then it's also what the reports are coming out of camp. The Athletic Mark Colby, who does the Steelers, basically said George Pickens has transformed into a more polished receiver with an expanded route tree. So just knowing that this kid was a dominant player in college, coming off a serious injury, and now he's starting to build up more polished route running, that gets me excited. But look at Kenny Pickett. In the 10 games he played with Pickett last year when Pickett played the whole game, 11.3 PPR points per game. In the 7 games where he played 75% of the snaps, he averaged 12.9 PPR points per game. That would have been wide receiver 30. He did that on a 17-game pace of 92 targets. That is it. If you just give him one more target a game, he jumps from 12.9 to 15.1. That would have been wide receiver 14. That's basically saying that he's only going to get 109 targets this season. So I think that just based on his history, and I also talk a lot about my opportunity analysis too. And if you don't know what that is, basically it just looks at vacated targets and the historical dropback rates of each play caller. The Steelers are calling for 115 opportunities. Allen Robinson can get most of those, and you're still going to get a few more targets towards George Pickens. So that's why I just feel like he's going to take that step. I think him and Kenny Pickett have a better connection. So that's why I have him as a must-have receiver this year. But what's your thoughts on George Pickens, Ben?
Yeah, look, I like George Pickens. I'm not quite as high as you are. I kind of see him as the kind of guy where I don't want him coming into my starting lineup. I don't want to draft him into a spot where he would naturally need to start for me in week 1. But I want him to be one of my first bench guys because I feel like the upside is really big. You talked about how big the upside is, and I totally agree. I love the fact that Allen Robinson's coming in. The fact Allen Robinson's coming in is a massive bump for both Johnson and Pickens as well. He just runs a whole heap of empty routes. He does it all day. He did it with the Rams. With the Rams, he was on the field basically 100% of the time, but he hasn't had more than 7 targets in a game since week 1, 2021. Like Allen Robinson just runs around. He's basically a professional runner-arounder. He doesn't do anything else, which is fantastic for Pickens and for Johnson. Johnson's going to get way more targets than anybody else. Deontay Johnson is really good. He was literally number one in open rate in the whole league last year. He's really good at getting open, and so he's going to be that safety blanket for Pickett. But because he's that safety blanket for Pickett and because he can draw the attention, it does open up room for Pickens as well. I expect Pickett to take a bit of a second-year jump. I don't think he's the kind of guy that we're going to see jumping into that QB1 range simply because of his volume. But I think he's going to take enough of a jump to help both Johnson and Pickens move forward. So while I know you're a bit lower on Johnson, a bit higher on Pickens, I'm higher on both. I think they can both take a step forward. I expect guys like Freiermuth to come back a little bit, and we'll see a little bit more of Washington coming in and doing slightly better blocking to help out the run game. That'll help out the pass game, and the whole offense moves forward. I like that Pickens was just as effective in losses as he was to wins, because I don't expect the Steelers to win a lot of games this year. I think they're going to be kind of that mid-table sort of team, and that's going to help him too. I really like the idea of Pickens getting a bump. Just don't draft him too early, or you're not getting any upside in value for where you drafted him, is my only concern.
All righty, let's jump down to the last one. It's Amari Cooper. Currently, I have him 10 spots higher than ADP at rank 31, so I'm there with you, my friend. So tell us why you have Amari Cooper as a must-have wide receiver.
I mean, look, he was the wide receiver 10 last year, and it seems to me like they're trying to improve the passing offense compared to last year. He goes from Jacoby Brissett to Deshaun Watson, which should be a step up. Now, we're hearing a lot of reports out of camp that Watson's struggling a little bit and the whole passing offense is struggling a little bit. But you got to take those camp reports with a grain of salt, and I think that's causing his ADP to drop a little bit. Realistically, he's the number one receiver here. There is nobody else that's going to really threaten him for targets. I know they've got a lot of other talented guys like Elijah Moore. Donovan Peoples-Jones is fine as a field stretcher. They've got Cedric Tillman coming in, but Cooper is the wide receiver one, and they're going to have to lean on him. They no longer have that second running back who's going to suck up a whole lot of targets in Kareem Hunt, which should in essence mean that Cooper gets even more targets as well. So I like the idea of the fact that you can get him as a wide receiver 15, but he's dropping more, and we're seeing people taking higher upside risks ahead of him when you can have that safety of Cooper, knowing that he still has wide receiver one upside as well. I feel like he's just so consistent. His last 7 years have been like wide receiver 19, wide receiver 13, wide receiver, he got injured, wide receiver 17, wide receiver 10, wide receiver 14, he got injured, wide receiver 10. There's a lot of like wide receiver 10 to 15 range finishes there. And if you're getting him at wide receiver 15, that means that there's a lot of upside there.
Yeah. So it's tough because you're taking a leap of faith that Watson returns to some level of what he was, right? Because the one thing that, before we get into Deshaun Watson, let's talk a bit quickly about, he did feature, of course, DeAndre Hopkins, and we know about Hopkins' dominance. But if you look at the number two options for the 2018 to 2020 when Deshaun Watson was quarterback, 2018, the number two option, not wide receiver, the number two option in targets, 45. Okay. 2019, 71. 2020, 75. Honestly, you could sit here right now and tell me that David Njoku, Elijah Moore, and Donovan Peoples-Jones will probably have 80-plus targets this year. If you told me that, I'd be like, okay, that makes sense.
Maybe.
Just the level of competition for targets is just so much better than it was for DeAndre Hopkins. So I can't imagine him getting to like that 160 range that we saw with DeAndre Hopkins. And then last season, without Watson, he averaged 8.5 targets per game. With Watson, 6.5. Now, Watson only attempted 28 passes a game during that stretch. That's much lower than his 17-game pace would have been, or his per-game pace when he was the Houston quarterback. So I just was like, all right, well, what would Amari Cooper's targets be if Watson starts throwing more like he did in 2018 to 2020? He would gain another target, so he'd be at 7.5. That would get him to 128 targets for a 17-game pace. That's almost identical to what he was last year. I'm like, all right, cool. So then I was like, well, what if we applied Deshaun Watson's, completion percentage and touchdown rate and completion percentage to 128 targets for Amari Cooper? Pretty good. 15.6 PPR points per game. That would have been T. Higgins last year. So that's if Watson is Watson from 2018 to 2020. So as you can tell, I'm in. I like this call. I'm in. But I just don't know if I feel comfortable having him at his, like, I have him at wide receiver 16, and that's 3 spots higher than ADP. And I feel good with that. But at the same time, the more I look at him, like, we're really banking on Watson becoming Watson again, and or one of those 3 other guys does not get enough targets. Because I can't imagine all 3 of those guys being prominent, and Deshaun Watson's not at 100% of what he used to be. And then Amari Cooper finishes as his top 15 wide receiver. I just don't see that scenario. So final thoughts about Cooper, any other receivers that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I think in general with the guys in this range, you just need to understand where the gaps are in tiers. I feel like, that is a hot take by Jamie. Elijah Moore's not going to be on the field for every snap, so it's going to be very hard for him to outproduce Cooper, but we'll see how we go.
He didn't say cold take. He said hot take. He didn't say lukewarm take either. He said hot take. So
it was smoking hot. It was smoking hot. I'm not going to challenge how hot it was, and if he's right, I'll give him full respect for that take. Realistically, I think we need to understand that the first 14 wide receivers are a long way from Cooper, who's my wide receiver 15. There's a big gap there. And realistically, with guys like Cooper and Hopkins and Keenan Allen and the whole heap of other guys in that range, I'd rather sit and wait to which of those guys falls. I've noticed in my draft so far, it's usually Amari Cooper that falls. He's dropping down to like wide receiver 18 or 19 when I'm drafting, and I'm picking him up in a lot of drafts. I don't really want to pick him up as the wide receiver 15, even though he is my 15th wide receiver. I'd rather take another position than wait till it comes around and see which of that tier is left. If it's Cooper, that's great. If it's Keenan Allen, that's great. If it's Hopkins, that's great. And then I can drop back, and the next guy I get after that is someone like Chris Godwin or Tyler Lockett, who's another guy I'm really high on as well. I feel like if you look at it that way, you're going to pick up whichever player gives you value rather than trying to get them at their kind of central point or even at their ceiling.
I have it Higgins, Allen, Ridley, and then I have Cooper. But I have Cooper in my top 150, a few spots behind a few running backs. So it sounds like you kind of have it similar. Who's the 3 receivers right before Cooper?
To me, the guys before Cooper are Higgins, Olave, Devontae Smith, and then also Jalen Waddle. I feel like that's a tier for me. And then the tier below is like Cooper, Hopkins, Allen, Ridley, guys like that. And then it jumps down again to guys like Godwin and Tyler Lockett and things like that. The reason these guys are a bit high for me is I don't have Christian Watson as high. I don't have DJ Moore as high. We're seeing these guys start to jump into that range. That's crazy for me. I'd much rather have all the guys we talked about today over a Christian Watson and over a DJ Moore.
I couldn't disagree more on DJ Moore, but that's another show that we'll have to get into. All right, once again, folks, that's what we got today. Those are our top 5 must-have wide receivers for 2023. Make sure you leave a comment and follow the channel. Your must-have receivers are for 2023. Now, Ben, before we go, make sure you tell the people where they can and what you got upcoming on Razzball and wherever you write your content.
Yeah, look, obviously, first thing, check out the website, ffdfantasyfootball.com. You can check us out on Twitter at FantasyFirstDown, no O. You can check us out on Instagram at TheFantasyFirstDown. Doing a heap of stuff for Razzball at the moment. At the moment, I'm writing my tight end ranking update article, which will come out soon. And then after that, we'll talk about the wide receivers as well. I just want to see the weekend's games before doing the wide receiver one. You can also get personalized rankings for your league. If you've heard what we're saying and you're like, well, look, that's all and good, but how do I know whether I take one of these guys or if I take a running back? What about in my situation when my league has tight end premium, or if I have an extra flex spot, or I have 3 wide receiver spots? What does that mean? Well, the answer is I can tell you exactly what that means. We'll provide you with personalized rankings. There's an article on Razzball. Go in there and we'll give you a discount as well. So check that out. Really keen for this weekend's preseason games. Yeah, appreciate it. And make sure you guys subscribe to our TikTok and IG. And, of course, make sure you go to Razzball.com. We got great writers writing constantly. By the way, enjoy football this weekend. We're going to see a lot more starters. I'm excited. Thank you for joining us again. Go follow me at Bobby LaMarco and Razzball NFL on Twitter. Thank you, Ben. We are out of here, folks.